Okay, hi everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks everyone for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. Although we are meeting virtually, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Renante, and I am a postdoc at BIOrg and the moderator for today's webinar. We're delighted today to have Dr. Rishad Habib from the Ted Rogers School of Management. Before I introduce Rishad, I would like to go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions for our speaker by clicking the Q&A tab at the top or bottom of your screen and typing into the entry box. At the end of the talk, and with time permitting, we will have a question and answer session in which I will select questions from the Q&A tab to ask our speaker. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rishad Habib. Rishad is an assistant professor in marketing at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. Her research focuses on how people react to shifting norms and novel marketing practices and its effects on their pro-social and sustainable decision-making. She also explores strategies to encourage positive behavior. Thank you, Rishad, for being here today, and please take it away.
Thank you, Renante, for that introduction, and thank you to BIOrg and to BIOrg for having me today. I'm really excited to present some of my work, and I'll just begin by sharing the slides. So today I'm going to be presenting work on new ways to shift consumers towards sustainable options. And as Renante mentioned, my name is Rishad, and I'm an assistant professor in marketing at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. And I just wanted to introduce my amazing co-authors. This work is with Catherine White, Dave Hardesty, and Jiaying Zhao at UBC. And I'm really excited to share this work with you, especially in light of sort of what's happened recently. So to sort of situate the context in which we're in, COP26 just ended a few days ago. And there were many decisions that were made, and some of us may or may not be as happy with the progress that was made at COP26. And I'm often asked, why not just have public policy? Why not change the policy levels? Why not make a carbon tax or something like that? And of course, those things are important, and I would definitely want that to happen. But making policy level changes is difficult. And so we need a multifaceted approach, one in which organizations, marketers, consumers, we're all working together to make positive changes and increase sustainable and climate-friendly behaviors. And it's encouraging to see that companies are stepping in this direction. A lot of companies are using sustainability as a market differentiator, and so many companies have committed to reducing their carbon footprint. So the latest count that I've seen, at least, is that 211 businesses have accepted the challenge of becoming net zero carbon emissions by 2040. And a lot of these are really big companies. A lot of them are on the Fortune 500 list. So this is a great step in the right direction. But at the same time as it's a great time to be sustainable, it's been shown that products with sustainability claims show twice the growth of their traditional counterparts, but it also still remains really challenging to be a sustainable company and to promote sustainability. So I wanted to take this chance to just poll some of you and see what your opinions on this are. When it comes to your own behaviors, which of these options seems the closest? I'm always sustainable in everything I do. I try to be sustainable, but I don't always manage it. I don't really try to be sustainable, or I try to be as unsustainable as possible. So just wait and see if there are any responses. The reason I ask this question is because research shows that a lot of consumers, a lot of people want to be sustainable. In fact, about 65% of people want to buy purpose-driven products and brands that care about sustainability, but there's only about 26% of people who actually reward companies for behaving in this sustainable manner. So this is what's often called an intention-action gap. And this is something that obviously is a concern for anyone who's promoting sustainability and promoting eco-friendly, climate-friendly behavior because of this intention-action gap. So I'm going to share with you a framework. Yes, and it turns out that 81% of you also agree that you try to be sustainable, but you don't always manage it. And the framework I'm going to share with you today will hopefully help you, whether you're a marketer who's trying to encourage their consumers to be more sustainable, a government organization, or any organization that wants to encourage your stakeholders, your employees, anyone to be sustainable, whether you're a parent that's trying to make your children sustainable, or you're an individual who just wants to encourage your own sustainability. You can try using some of these techniques in your daily lives. So this framework is based on a review of over 320 academic articles. And we use that to create a framework with 5 psychological routes to shifting sustainable behaviors. These are social influence, habit formation, individual self, feelings and cognition, and tangibility. And so what I'm going to do is I'll go over each of these in turn, share a few examples, and then share how to use the frameworks overall. Okay, so let's get into it. The first factor is social influence. This is the simple idea that the attitudes, the expectations, the behaviors of everyone around us play a large role in how we behave. And this is especially important in the context of engaging in pro-environmental actions. So there's 3 things under social influence: social norms, social desirability, and social group membership. And I'll share some examples that illustrate the power of social norms, especially in contexts where a behavior is not the norm. So one of the challenges we have with climate-friendly behaviors or sustainable behaviors is most people don't actually do them. So for instance, most people don't actually install solar panels. But research shows, and this is a large field study with over 1.4 million people across 50 towns, they showed that those who promoted solar panel installations, who were ambassadors, they were 62.8% more effective if they themselves had installed solar panels. So if an advocate is also somebody who does the behavior themselves, then that increases their credibility and it increases the number of people who follow their behavior, even when the behavior is not very normal or normative. Another behavior that's really helpful for climate change, that's really sustainable, is switching to a more plant-based diet or reducing meat consumption. But it's not the norm again. However, it's been increasing steadily over the last 10 years. And so communicating this increase, this dynamic norm, increase the number of people who ordered meatless lunches at a campus cafeteria. In fact, it doubled it. So saying that, the number of people has increased in the last 5 years versus just stating the percentage of people who choose meatless lunches or who choose to eat less meat, doubled the chances that someone would order a meatless lunch at a campus cafeteria. So next, let's look at habits. And habits are any behavior that's automatic, that's relatively uncontrolled. It's very easy for you to perform. You don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it because these are automatic. And one of the challenges with sustainability or climate-friendly behaviors is that a lot of our habits are not very sustainable. We first need to break those bad habits. And two of the things that we use are discontinuity and penalties. And once we've broken bad habits, we can replace them with new ones. We can form new good habits by making it easy, providing prompts, giving incentives, and giving continuous real-time feedback about our performance. So how can we break bad habits, and what is discontinuity? Discontinuity basically means any kind of large context change, because habits are associated with cues such as you see your keys, you grab the keys, and you drive your car to work, right? And you know the route, you don't have to look at a map because you know it by heart. But a context change, for instance, moving houses, changes all of that. You can't do it automatically. Even if you get into your car, you still have to open up Google Maps, figure out how to get to your new destination or your old destination through a new route. And so this kind of a context change is a really good time in which to initiate new habits or new sustainable habits. One study found that if you compared recent movers to people who hadn't moved, recent movers reduced their car usage from 64% down to 37% of the time. They pretty much halved their car usage after an intervention that encouraged them to behave more sustainably. A lot of the things that we use for habits are very strong, like behavioral economic nudges. And this is obviously the context in which this whole shift framework is. It's behavioral nudges and behavioral interventions. So 3 of these that are really powerful are defaults, incentives, and feedback. And there's a study that sought to quantify how much energy was saved. And they found that defaults for lower meat consumption lowered emissions by 51 kgs of carbon dioxide per individual. Incentives for driving less lowered 571 kgs of carbon dioxide, and providing feedback on energy use reduced 149 kilograms of carbon dioxide per individual or household. So these are really large amounts that are taking place just with one specific, relatively small change in the way in which people are communicated to. So you're either having a default, or you're having incentives, or you're having feedback. These could be even larger if we combine them together and encourage people with all of these things at once, right? So the next factor I'm going to talk about is the individual self. So individuals are always motivated to have a positive view of themselves. And there are a lot of factors in the individual self. For instance, we have differences. We are not the same. There are individual differences so we're motivated by different things. There's things like self-efficacy, self-interest, self-consistency, and self-concept that are critical to understanding how the individual self works. So I'll go into 2 of these right now and not really go into most of them. So the first is this idea that people want to have a positive view of themselves. So recent work shows that buying products, such as repurposed products, can make people have a positive view of themselves. It can make people feel special, that they're using a backpack, for instance, that nobody else has because their backpack used to be an airbag, or their fork used to be a light bulb. Something along those lines makes consumers feel special. And this is increasing the demand for these kind of repurposed products. Another thing we find is that sustainability can also lead to negative views of yourself. So for instance, sustainability has been associated with femininity, and so it is not seen so positively by men. Oftentimes, men are less likely to support sustainable causes. And this really cool research finds that if you can change your branding a bit to appeal to men, use masculine branding. For instance, instead of calling it the Friends of Nature Club, you call it the Wilderness Rangers. then this kind of affirmation, masculine affirmation, can help close the gender gap between how much women want to behave sustainably and how much men want to behave sustainably. If you think of things like Tesla, which has really good branding, it doesn't make it feel like having an eco-friendly car is less masculine. In fact, it's probably even more so, right? And this individual difference can also be used in a different kind of way. So a lot of research in consumer behavior and in marketing and in psychology shows that women tend to be more communal and that they tend to be more invested in making climate-friendly, sustainable decisions. So this research did this really cool thing where they looked at collective village groups in 3 different countries. And they either let the groups form naturally or they had a quota so that half the group members had to be women. And they saw what sort of decisions these groups made in the long run. And they found that groups that were 50% women ended up conserving more trees than groups that were allowed to form whichever way they wanted. So including women in groups can increase the number of sustainable and eco-friendly decisions that are being made. So you can think of that as like, if we increase gender equity in boardrooms, then that might also encourage eco-friendly, sustainable actions. Okay, on to the 4th factor. So the 4th factor is feelings and cognition. And we lump these 2 together because people are influenced by their feelings, their intuition, which is often referred to as system 1. And they're also influenced by their more deliberative cognitions, their rational system, which is system 2. And while this intuitive feeling system tends to be really fast, the deliberative cognitive system tends to be slow and take its time. So there are certain situations, of course, in which we are able to use our system 1 and others in which we rely more on system 2. So we can divide this up into having positive emotions such as warm glow or pride versus negative emotions like fear or guilt. And under cognitions, we can also have information provided to people. We can frame choices in different ways, or we can label them differently. So I go through just a couple examples on this. Firstly, there is recent research that shows that not only do these sort of positive emotions lead to purchasing or using sustainable eco-friendly products, but that using eco-friendly products also leads to greater enjoyment. And being able to use them makes you feel that warm glow, which eventually increases your purchase intentions for the product. So what they did is they had participants come in and write things with either something that they thought was an eco-friendly pen or just a normal pen. And then they asked them, how likely would you be to buy this pen? Or they also used headphones and other products in this. And they found that when you use an eco-friendly pen, people were much more interested. They felt much happier about their whole experience writing, and it made them want to buy that pen in the future. So this is a good idea if you have a store. You might want to make your consumers use the products so that they feel this enjoyment, this warm glow, and then ask them if they want to buy it. Another way we see this sort of come out is in made-to-order products. So made-to-order products are products that will only be made once you put in your order. So in this particular study, one of the things that they used was books. So the book will be printed after you make your order. When it comes to made-to-order products, you're making the decision of whether it's going to be recycled or whether it's going to be made from sort of new paper, recycled paper or new paper. And they found that this study finds that people want to lower their feelings of anticipated guilt, and they would feel really guilty if they made a book and they didn't choose the recycled materials. So a lot more people chose to use recycled paper in the made-to-order condition than one in which the book was already printed and it was already made, because they didn't feel that guilt for that already created product. moving on to the more deliberate cognitions, or system 2, one of the challenges with sustainable or climate-friendly behavior is that we don't actually know which is the most climate-friendly option. I mean, I struggle with this, and I don't always know what would be the most sustainable option if I was to purchase it. So this study looks at communicating that information very clearly using easy-to-read labels. And what they use here is light bulb hours. They compare the carbon emissions or the carbon footprint from beef noodle soup versus vegetable soup. And the beef noodle soup has about 2,400 light bulb minutes equivalent, whereas the vegetable soup only has 345. When you put it this way and you make the information so clear, you find that people tend to choose the vegetarian vegetable soup over the beef soup. But because they don't know this information, or it's not top of mind beforehand, you don't see this unless you have a clear label. Another research in this line looks at framing these things in a cost-effective way. So instead of looking at the dollar value of a LED versus a less energy efficient bulb, you can frame it in terms of the 10-year dollar cost. So this includes the energy savings that you would make from having a more energy efficient bulb. And here they show, this study was carried out in Shoppers Drug Marts and in London Drugs. And this was with 10-year dollar cost of CFL versus LED bulbs. And they found that it increased the energy efficient purchases from just 12% to 48%, which means that more than almost half of the people who were buying light bulbs were choosing to buy the more energy efficient bulbs because of this 10-year dollar cost framing. The last one I'm going to talk about is tangibility. And tangibility is really important because one of the most interesting features of sustainability or climate change is that it can often feel abstract and psychologically distant. So it's going to happen far off in the future to somebody who's living far away. I'm not going to feel the impacts of climate change, though that may be changing over time, especially in the West, as more and more climate disasters are happening. Like even right now, BC is going through a huge storm and there were wildfires just a few months ago. Now it's a huge storm, towns are being flooded. So these kind of climate disasters can make things feel psychologically closer. But in general, tangibility is an issue. So some of the things that we can do to make it, to address the issue of tangibility is to communicate the local and proximal impacts. So communicate that climate disasters will happen in your area if climate change goes the way it's going. We can also match temporal focus. We can encourage the desire for intangible products, and we can engage in more concrete communications. So how can we make the communications more concrete? This one study looks at making the recycling process more concrete by telling you exactly what the recycled product is going to be. So instead of saying something like recycling conserves natural resources or that it just gives you a new life, the fact that recycling makes new plastic bottles and showing that plastic bottle in a concrete representation, it gives you greater interest in these advertisements. And they did a field study in outdoor events and residences, in like student residences, and found that these posters increased recycling in these real situations as well, because it made it more concrete to people. So another thing that you can do if you don't want to make the situation more concrete is make consumers or people think more abstractly. So you can make them think about the future. So you can ask consumers, for instance, how will you be remembered? Think about your legacy. What are you leaving behind? People who are asked this question ended up donating 45% more to a climate change charity because they wanted to leave something good for the future. And you're not usually thinking about the future, but now that the researchers have asked you to, you're more likely to think about it and more likely to donate to climate change charities. So I also want to say, like, how would you use the framework? There is no one best technique. There's no one best factor. There is a lot of work that goes into figuring out what factor would be best for you and how to communicate it in your particular situation. So the first step of using the framework is always to clarify and understand the context really, really well. You also want to identify the target. You want to identify the drivers of behavior so that you really know what your target market is responding to, what they are motivated by, what their barriers are, the whole context really, really well. Then you want to select some tools, you want to apply them. And very, very importantly, and I'm sure everyone who is involved in behavioral insights will say this as well, you must test your strategy. Don't just go out there and apply it because it worked sometime. You need to test your strategy very carefully with a relatively smaller sample of your target population. And then you want to evaluate your outcomes. If they're favorable, go ahead and implement them. You should be able to see the similar change if you implement it on a wider scale. But if you evaluate it and you see that it's not working the way you wanted it to, then you can go back and see why isn't it working, what tools would be better, and test it again, and then evaluate and implement it when it's really, really good. So as a closing note, there's no single factor that is the key to changing people's behavior, but there's a combination of factors or a range of factors that can be useful in shifting people to behave in a more sustainable, climate-friendly manner. And I really do think that if we use social influence, habits, individual selves, feelings and cognition, and tangibility in a more effective way, we'll be able to change people's behaviors more efficiently. So thank you so much for attending today, and thank you for listening. I would be happy to take any questions or any feedback that you have. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any feedback or ask now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that, Rashid. It was wonderful. We do have a few questions, but just before we get started, one of the attendees just asking if they could see the second slide on light bulb labeling, showing that the 10-year cost relative to upfront price. They were just wanted to note the citation, and then we can get into some of the other questions.
So that one is a working paper at the moment. So let me just share my slide again, right? If I wanted to, or should I just share it in the chat?
Oh, either would work.
Okay, yeah, I'll just put the citation.
Okay, cool. All right, so one of the first questions you have here. So can these factors be combined to make them more effective? And can you give an example?
Oh, that's a great question. And yes, the answer is yes, they can be combined, but it depends on your particular context and the particular behavior that you're studying. So you might find that it's effective, for instance, to combine things within a factor. So for instance, in emotions, fear can be a really strong negative emotion that makes people scared to act. So you can balance something like that with a different emotion like hope. Provide people with something that scares them a little, but say, okay, there's hope, here's what you can do to change. Because hope is related more to self-efficacy and it sort of helps balance out the fear. So that's like within a factor. But you can also try to combine different factors with one another. If you are doing social influence, you can always try to make it easier, put in make the habits easier to perform, give incentives, provide feedback. And that's often what we're doing with things like social influence. We're often saying that, compared to your neighbors, you are more versus less eco-friendly. You've used more versus less energy, and that's been shown to be really effective if you happen to be using more energy than your neighbors. So you want to reduce your energy consumption to their levels. If you add to that something like real-time feedback so that people can see how they're doing, that might help make it even more effective.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. The second question we have here. So you shared a lot of academic research in this area, but are there any companies that have done a good job of encouraging sustainability using these factors?
Oh yeah, definitely. Lots of companies, as I mentioned, there's more and more companies that are committing to this, and more companies that are coming out and sharing new techniques. Some of the ones that I've really liked, I've really liked how Beyond Meat has portrayed moving towards plant-based foods, and how they've kind of told people that, again, like focus more on the future and hope and things like that. I mentioned Tesla, that has done a great job of using a much more masculine technology of the future type branding, rather than using a green eco-friendly Prius type branding, and that's been really effective for them as well. A company that I personally really like, but I'm hoping they come to Canada soon, is Loop. Loop provides reusable glass packaging that you can pick up at the grocery store, and then you can just return. So you don't have to change your behavior as much. You can just buy the products the way you would have bought them and return them when you go to your next trip to your local grocery store. But they'll take care of the middle process where they clean it and reuse it and distribute it again.
Okay, that's great, thanks. So we have some other questions here. We have one from Jason Lee, who writes, so in your recent study, you referenced Valkengode and Steg in highlighting social influence, feelings, and cognition in individual self as having a particularly strong impact in behavior change. Would you agree with this based on your own literature review, and can you expand on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Jason. And it's true that this analysis that they did, the meta-analysis, showed that among these factors, social influence, feelings and cognition, and individual self were most strong in having effect on behavior change. That doesn't mean that habits or tangibility aren't strong, because it is really contextually dependent. And a situation in which you can increase tangibility might be when there's, for instance, a storm happening. So social influence might be useful here, feelings and cognition would be, but it might be most relevant to focus on the tangible impacts on you as an individual or as a person, because you are facing these circumstances at the moment. So again, it's sort of, I definitely agree that these are very strong. And I would probably say that in a lot of cases, or even in most cases, you can apply social influence, feelings and cognition, and individual self to make behaviors more sustainable. But again, it always depends on the context.
Okay, great, thanks, Rishad. Another question here from Chris Ballard. How might you advise a politician or government wishing to be more aggressive on climate change policy, but feeling hamstrung because of a lack of consumer support? What should those of us working to influence government say or do?
That is a difficult question, Chris. And I would say that, firstly, I would kind of want to ask you, like, is there a lack of consumer support? There seems to be a lot of consumer support. Like, a lot of consumers definitely support the idea of being sustainable and support sustainable companies. And I would say, look at young consumers, look at those who are not yet voting, but are going to vote in 4 years. They tend to often be really concerned about climate change because, again, it's more tangible for them than it is for people who are not really going to be around in 2100 or 2050. So you can look at them and you can You can survey them, you can ask them, and then share that with your other politicians or members of parliament or government, and tell them that, look, this is the future. This is what we need to deal with in the future. That's one thing, but I'm sure there are many people in government and other politicians who'd be able to advise you a lot better on this specific way of communicating this issue.
Okay, great, wonderful answer. Another question we have here from Matt, one of our postdocs here at BIOrg. He writes, there are quite a few BI frameworks floating around these days. So I'm just wondering what motivated you to develop the SHIFT framework in particular, which he quite likes, by the way. For example, does it address shortcomings of other frameworks like Mindspace or East or TIPME? And should we view the SHIFT framework as complementary or unique in the broader framework or landscape?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Matt. And I mean, obviously, you know that there are many frameworks that are available. I especially like East because it's really nice and simple. The SHIFT framework was developed primarily thinking about the key challenges about sustainability in particular. And there's a few things about sustainability that makes it different from other things. There's a self-other trade-off that happens because you have to often sacrifice something like time, energy, or money in order to help probably others, people you may never meet. There's also a long time horizon when it comes to sustainability. You have to wait, maybe not so much anymore, but you might have to wait to see the consequences of your actions, or you might have to engage in collective action. Because even though the numbers I put, for instance, for default or incentives, it's quite nice, but they're really at an individual level, so they don't make much of an impact unless it's collective. There's a level of abstractness when it comes to climate change. There's a certain amount of uncertainty about what the consequences are going to be. And there's a lot of ingrained habits that we have. So unlike East or Mindspace, which are very general and can be applied in every situation, we were looking to find behaviors and psychological factors that are especially useful when it comes to sustainability or eco-friendly pro-social behaviors. So I hope that answers some of your questions, Matt.
Thanks, Rishad. So one of our other postdocs, Jingxi, also wrote in, thanks, this is a great framework. My question is, what are some of the barriers you can see when implementing this framework? Are there any domains that would be especially hard for this to be realized?
I mean, Jingxi, that's a great question. And there are so many barriers to behaving sustainably. I mean, the poll we just did, 85% of people say, and these are people who are obviously interested in sustainability because they're here watching this talk. So even they don't manage to be as sustainable as they want to. So there's many barriers. I think that one of the things that we've begun to address and we've begun to sort of see technology address is the cost barrier, because obviously if something costs more, oftentimes for people that becomes a really hard step to get over. But like you've seen, like 10-year energy costs of eco-friendly light bulbs is much lower than that of an energy inefficient product. We've seen the price of like Teslas or any other kind of electric vehicle go down significantly. We've seen solar panels can produce energy at rates that are on par with or even cheaper than coal and gas. So I think that's one of the barriers that I've seen addressed. But there's many more. We could talk more about it. If you just feel free to send me an email and I'll talk more about what contexts and barriers we see. I'd love to hear from you too.
Great. Thanks for that answer, Rishad. I have actually a question of my own, and it sort of it relates to Matt's question about how you develop this framework. So I guess my question is like, what I guess theories or like what was this really based on? Like what motivated you to pick particularly those five like aspects or principles, like what about it was like unique to what did you find was unique to this area of environment and sustainability?
Yeah, that's a lot of reading to answer your first part of the question. In order to develop the framework, we just first started out with gathering all the information. So we looked at marketing, psychology, sociology, economics, journals, and sort of started reading through and seeing what is being mentioned, what are people working on. And these 5 factors started coming up again and again when it came to like sustainable behavior and sustainable decision making. So that's the origin story. It was then sort of, we kept some of the articles, we focused on articles that were high quality, that had field research, that had behavioral interventions, for instance, that we could really rely on, large samples, for instance. But we looked at a really wide variety of articles when we were initially developing the framework. And your second question is sort of like, how do these relate to sustainability in particular? Well, it again goes back, I think, to the challenges of being sustainable. So if you have this need for collective action, for instance, it's hard to tell people to behave sustainably if they think that their individual work is not going to have a difference. So in this case, social influence can be really more effective in that way, because you can encourage, you can tell them that other people are behaving like this, and you're like, oh, okay, well then maybe I can join this collective action that's already happening. So while habits are great, and making it easy is always great, in this particular context, if you're feeling like it's not going to make a difference, just making it easy might not be enough. You might want to also encourage people by saying that, look, other people are behaving in this way. And so that's kind of how we thought about developing these specific factors and looking at the specific research underneath each of these factors. I didn't really go into them, but there's a lot on, like, say, for instance, social norms, social group membership, social desirability specifically, that could help address sustainable and climate-friendly behaviors specifically. But yeah, I'm happy to talk more about it, Renate.
Great. So we have more questions coming in. One here from Jessica, who writes, "Hi Rishad, wonderful presentation and great summary of studies. My question is similar to Matthew's. Could you provide more context on whether you see this framework as MISI, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, and building upon shortcomings in other behavioral science frameworks or other pro-environmental behavior frameworks like value, belief, norm, ABC theory, affordance theory, norm activation, etc. Also, how do you see this framework applying to adaptation-related behaviors, like the flip side of the climate change mitigation coin?"
Yeah, that's a great question. Very broad, difficult question, Jessica. I definitely see this as sort of building on other frameworks. It's not that you wouldn't use the other frameworks in these contexts. It's not like something that would overshadow anything else. It's just something that brings together the work in sustainability that we hadn't seen exist at that point in time. There was no framework that was specifically directed towards these sustainable, climate-friendly behaviors. And while you might want to encourage people to save money, you might want to encourage people to eat healthier, all of these things, those are really important things as well. But our framework looks at this like one specific context, but even then I'm saying it's highly context dependent, because what you do with this framework is again context dependent. So I guess it was it could be seen as sort of a drive to focus and narrow the context a little so that it's more useful if you're using it in a specific context. But I would definitely say you should be looking at these existing theories that exist and applying them to understand the context and the situation further.
Mm-hmm. Great. And actually another follow-up question I had about this idea of frameworks in general. So a lot of these frameworks, they don't necessarily make a distinction between like using the components of the framework to identify barriers versus using them to, to create solutions. I guess I wonder how like your framework, like how well does it deal with that? Like, are each of those components more suited to guide basically the like the exploration and analysis section part phase of a behavior change project, like when you're like designing, when you're drawing up a behavioral map and identifying barriers, or is it the part after that where you're coming up with the solutions? Like which would this be better suited for?
I would definitely think that it's more for the solution aspect of it, because as I was saying in how to use the framework, you should be looking at the barriers and context before you're looking at like the barriers and context in your specific situation. So in that case, you want to know who your target market is. You want to know what their specific barriers are, what motivates them, what drives them. So if they are, for instance, highly sustainable to begin with, they're very motivated by sustainability, maybe all you need to do is provide the right information, give them the right labels, give them the right tools to behave in a certain way, and they will follow, right? Because they are already motivated to act in that way. But if they are consumers or people who are they don't really care about sustainability, they might do it if other people were doing it. In that case, maybe social influence would be more important. And I would say that it's more targeted towards that solution aspect, or coming up with interventions, coming up with ways to communicate or messaging that you give to people, rather than towards identifying the barriers.
Great. So we have actually a couple of questions here from another attendee, Balachandar. I'll read the second one first, I guess. So though the temporal framing helps to people realize the cost over time, some people don't benefit because of their economic conditions. People who have less money to spend at a specific point of time cannot afford the sustainable products. How do you think this distributional effects of nudges can be mitigated?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think what you were talking about the 10-year cost framing, perhaps that's the particular one you were looking at. It's not, in that particular case, there is no extra cost upfront. Even though it's framed as like a 10-year cost, like yes, there's no, that 10-year cost is not fully realized at the beginning. But at the beginning, there is a difference between like a $4 light bulb and a $12 light bulb. So I'm guessing that the benefits are not realized until later and the costs are borne up front. I would say like you can look at how a lot of developing countries are handling these situations in order to sort of take inspiration. I'm from Bangladesh, and we have one of the largest solar home system projects in, I think, the world. But the main thing, or one of the main things that have been done, is Bangladesh's Professor Muhammad Yunus pioneered the microcredit system. So when it comes to distributing solar home systems, how are people in Bangladesh who don't earn a lot affording to buy it? They're using microcredit, and they are buying the solar home system in installments that are equivalent to how much they would have paid for their gas bill, basically. Like if they were to use a kerosene lamp or something, that cost is put into the solar home system, and then over the course of a year or two, they buy it. So that would be one way of mitigating this inequity when it comes to nudges, by allowing people to take loans, or allowing the government to give rebates, or companies to give rebates, so that people can realize the benefits and the cost can be reduced upfront.
Right. And Balachandar's other question, it's interesting how defaults are categorized under habits. Defaults is employed to change your behavior rather than habits. And I think this like speaks to, I think a deeper issue of like, when you're targeting behaviors to change, how do you target like certain like one-off behaviors that don't necessarily form a habit versus behaviors that keep recurring, that are more like habits?
Yeah, The habits would be most appropriate, like you mentioned, for behaviors that are recurring, that occur at a specific time every day. One of the things we have is prompts, and having a prompt, for instance, like a grocery bag that's hanging behind your door or in your car, is really easy for you to remember at the right time and place. So it's not so useful to encourage habits when it's not a recurring behavior. And going to Balchander's question about why defaults fall under habits, the habit section is really about building good habits and breaking bad habits. When it comes to building good habits, the best thing you can do is make it effortless, make it really, really easy, make it the default. So one of the best things that you can do is to just have the eco-friendly option as the only option that you have. And that makes it easy for consumers, builds really good habits. So instead of deciding that every day you're going to take a 2-minute shower really, really fast in cold water, just install a low flow shower head. And that will make your default shower that will change the default, because you will be using less water per minute than you would have. So you can take your normal shower, but you'll be using less water. So the difference, I guess, is between the really time-consuming, effortful action of always watching your behavior versus making it the default so that it's automatic. It's always already ingrained in what you're already doing. So I hope that answers some parts of the question, but feel free to sort of ask more.
Chris, we have just a little bit of time for a few more questions, and I guess I wanted to put this framework in context of more recent initiatives in the environment and sustainability area. So there's a lot of work going into creating decision-based tools to help people make greener decisions. For example, the behavioral insights teams, they launched this Get Greener tool.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, it's they have the website. Their URL is get-greener.com. But also, like the Biden administration is also making climate information and decision tools more accessible. So I guess how does your framework sort of fit into that larger context with these decision-based tools being people trying to make them more readily available?
Yeah, I'm excited to see all these decision-based tools come out, and I didn't know about the Get Greener thing, so that's really cool. Everybody should go and check it out. And I've said before, it's a multi-pronged approach. It's a really complex problem. We're hopefully going to solve it before things get really bad, but we're not going to solve it in a day. So the more people that come out and produce these tools, the better it is. One way in which I could see this working is maybe the Biden administration reads our paper and considers the shift factors when they're developing their communication strategy or when they're developing their tools. Or when their paper is out, we can also work on seeing how the shift factors, or when their tools are out, we can also work on seeing how the shift factors might engage with those tools. And it would be great if there were, for instance, much better carbon footprint tracking, or being able to know how much energy you're using on a daily basis, which is hard, right? It's not, your carbon emissions are not visible. So you don't know how much carbon you're emitting, but your actions are always contributing a little. So if you wanted to keep track of it, it's hard. I know of a company called Kogo that's using, and their hope is to sort of be able to tie it into your purchases so that they'll be able to, like, for instance, if they know what you're buying through your credit card, they'll be able to give you an approximation of what your carbon emissions are based on your purchases, which could help a lot of people who are consciously trying to reduce their carbon emissions. Again, I think it's a complex problem. And so having more and more people work on these initiatives, having more tools available to people, to consumers. I mean, there can be tools for specific groups, for instance, parents who, with their children, there can be tools for like specific organizations. So these will also if you make it narrower and narrower, it'll be more applicable to that specific context.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rhett. So we have time for just one more question, and I thought I'd ask, like which of these 5 factors are your favorite, or what do you think is the best to use?
Oh, Renate, you're asking me to choose a favorite child or something like that. But no, I think all of them are really effective in different contexts, but the one that I guess I use in other research, or the one I turn to the most, is social norms. I found them to be extremely powerful. It's so interesting, like how much of our behaviors and how much of how we act and think is just based on the norms, how much it changes even just when you go to a new country and suddenly you behave slightly differently because the norm is different, but also how sticky they are and how hard it is to change it. So I have other research where I'm looking more at the effect of social norms and how we can get people to engage in sort of less normative behaviors that are less common. And so that would be I wouldn't say my favorite, but the one that I engage with the most.
Great. That was great, Rishad. Thank you so much. So again, we'd like to thank Dr. Rishad Habib for leading our webinar today. To our guests, a full recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking the side tab labeled Events and then clicking the sub tab labeled BIOrg Webinar Series. Our next webinar will be on December 9th, and we will hear from Dr. Chiara Varazani, who is the lead behavioral scientist at the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation. So thank you all for attending, and you can exit this webinar by closing your Zoom screen. Thanks again, Rishad, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for hosting this, Janant, and obviously thanks to BIOrg and BIOrg